My parents took my Cadillac Escalade keys and handed them to my younger sister because, according to them, she needed the car more. 12 hours later, the 83,000 SUV was wrapped around a concrete barrier. Her boyfriend had vanished without a trace, and somehow everyone in my family was pointing at me as if I had been behind the wheel. Stick with me because what they did to protect my sister nearly destroyed my life, and what I uncovered about that night changed our family forever. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe. My name is Blair Lane. I was 29 years old and working brutal shifts as a nurse. Nothing in my life had ever been handed to me. Every overtime shift I picked up, every holiday I worked instead of resting, every exhausted drive home afterward, all of it went towards saving up for the vehicle I'd always dreamed of owning. A Cadillac Escalade. I paid for every single dollar of it myself. Unfortunately, nothing I ever accomplished seemed to impress my family. My younger sister, Sky, had always been the golden child. Whatever she wanted, my parents somehow found a way to make happen. Whenever she messed up, they were quick with excuses on her behalf. Growing up, I learned early on that arguing rarely changed the outcome of anything. One Saturday evening, we all gathered at my parents' house for dinner. Everything felt ordinary enough until Sky casually mentioned she wanted to borrow my Escalade for a weekend getaway with her boyfriend, Jace. I said no right away. The vehicle had cost me everything, and I wasn't comfortable with anyone taking it out of town. Sky rolled her eyes and accused me of being selfish. My parents jumped to defend her almost instantly. Dean and Paige Lane, my parents, reacted as though I'd committed some unforgivable offense simply by setting a boundary. They insisted Sky deserved a break, and that family was supposed to help family. When I held my ground and refused again, things escalated in a way I never expected. My father reached across the table and snatched my keys right out of my hand, while my mother told me I was overreacting. Moments later, they handed the keys straight to Sky. I sat there in stunned silence. The Escalade was legally mine. I had paid for it in full, and yet everyone at that table acted as though my opinion carried no weight at all. Humiliated and seething, I left without another word. That night, I tried convincing myself the whole thing would blow over by morning. I showered, got ready for bed, and ignored the stream of messages coming in from my family. Then, just before midnight, my phone buzzed once more. It was a text from Jace. Short but enough to make my stomach twist instantly. "We need to talk. There's something important you don't know." I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to guess what he meant. I had no idea yet that message marked the start of a nightmare that would eventually tear my entire family apart. The next morning, I woke to my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. At first, I assumed I'd overslept and was late for work. But when I saw more than a dozen missed calls from my parents, my stomach dropped instantly. The second I picked up, my mother was already screaming. "Blair, what have you done?" I sat up in bed, completely lost. Before I could even ask what she meant, my father grabbed the phone from her. "Your Escalade is destroyed." For a few seconds, the words didn't even register. "What do you mean destroyed?" I asked. "There was an accident," he snapped back. "The vehicle is totaled." My heart started pounding. That Escalade represented years of saving and sacrifice. I jumped out of bed demanding details, but neither of my parents seemed the least bit interested in explaining what had actually happened. Instead, they went straight to blaming me. According to them, the argument at dinner had upset Sky so badly that she'd been distracted the entire night. Somehow, in their minds, the whole situation was my fault for not simply handing over the vehicle in the first place. The accusation made absolutely no sense. I reminded them again that they were the ones who had physically taken my keys and given them to her. They brushed that fact aside completely. A short while later, I finally got Sky on the phone. Her story felt off from the very first sentence. She claimed she'd never actually driven the Escalade at all, that she'd returned the keys hours earlier and had nothing to do with the crash. When I pressed her on who had actually been behind the wheel, she got defensive and dodged the question entirely. Something about it didn't sit right with me. As the morning wore on, more details started trickling in. Police investigating the crash mentioned that witnesses were giving conflicting accounts of what they'd seen. Statements didn't line up with one another. Nobody seemed entirely sure who had actually been driving before the crash happened. Then came another problem. Jace was nowhere to be found. Nobody could reach him. His phone rang and rang with no answer, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. The last person confirmed to be with Sky had simply vanished. That was the moment it hit me. Somebody wasn't telling the truth. Things only got worse when my parents brought up the insurance company. They wanted me to tell the adjuster that I had willingly loaned the Escalade to Sky, insisting over and over that it would be the simplest way to handle the whole mess. I refused because that wasn't what had actually happened. They were the ones who'd taken my keys against my will and given them to her themselves. The harder they pushed me to repeat their version of events, the more suspicious I became. The crash itself was bad enough, but it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't the only thing my family was trying to bury. After days of my parents pressuring me to back their story, I finally stopped waiting around for someone to give me straight answers. If I wanted the truth, I was going to have to go find it myself. The first thing that bothered me was Sky's timeline. She kept insisting that she had returned the Escalade hours before the crash. According to her, she wasn't even near the vehicle when the accident happened. The problem was that every time she told the story, small details seemed to change. I decided to retrace her movements. The highway where the crash occurred wasn't far from several businesses. I spent an afternoon visiting locations along the route, hoping someone had seen something useful. Most people remembered very little, but one gas station employee told me the police had already requested security footage from the night of the accident. That caught my attention immediately. A few days later, through contacts and persistence, I was able to learn what was shown in the footage. The video completely destroyed Sky's story. There she was, standing beside my Escalade late that night, hours after she claimed she had returned the keys. The timestamp was clear. The vehicle was visible, so was Sky. I stared at the evidence in disbelief. She had lied, not exaggerated, not misunderstood, lied. Armed with that information, I confronted her directly. At first, she denied everything. Then, when she realized I knew about the footage, her explanation suddenly changed. She claimed she had only stopped briefly. Then she said she was meeting a friend. A few minutes later, she changed the story again and insisted she couldn't remember exactly what happened. Every answer created more questions. What shocked me even more was my parents' reaction. Instead of demanding honesty from Sky, they immediately attacked me. They accused me of obsessing over the accident and trying to destroy my sister's future. My mother said I should let the situation go before it caused permanent damage to the family. My father claimed I was acting vindictive because I had never wanted Sky to use the Escalade in the first place. Not one of them seemed concerned that Sky had been caught lying. Then another piece of information surfaced. Police had recovered Jace's phone near the crash site. The device was heavily damaged and barely recognizable. Investigators believed it had been there since the night of the accident. That discovery changed everything. If Jace had left the area safely, why was his phone found near the wreckage? Why had he disappeared without contacting anyone? And why was everyone so determined to avoid talking about him? The missing boyfriend quickly became the biggest mystery in the entire case. As I looked at the growing pile of contradictions, one thought kept returning to my mind. This wasn't a simple car accident. Too many people were hiding things. Too many stories kept changing. And with every new fact I uncovered, I became more convinced that the truth about that night was far worse than anyone was willing to admit. The more evidence I uncovered, the more desperate my parents became. Instead of asking why Sky kept changing her story, Dean and Paige focused all their energy on convincing me to take responsibility for the insurance claim. Every phone call seemed to turn into the same argument. They insisted that families protect each other. What they really meant was that I should protect Sky. One evening, my parents invited me to their house for what they called a serious discussion. The moment I walked in, I knew it wasn't a conversation. It was an intervention. My mother looked exhausted, while my father sat at the table with several papers in front of him. "Just help your sister," he said. I asked what that meant. He pushed the documents toward me and suggested I tell the insurance company that I had willingly loaned the Escalade to Sky. According to him, it would make everything easier. When I refused, the excuses started. "Sky is younger," my mother said quietly. "She has her whole life ahead of her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was their daughter, too. Yet they were asking me to risk financial consequences and possibly legal problems simply because protecting Sky mattered more than protecting me. I stood up and told them no. That answer changed everything. Within days, relatives who had always been friendly suddenly became distant. Some stopped returning my calls. Others sent messages criticizing me for being selfish and unforgiving. It didn't take long to figure out why. My parents had been telling people their own version of the story. According to them, I was creating unnecessary conflict and refusing to help the family during a difficult time. Most relatives only heard their side and accepted it as the truth. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. Then I learned something that made the situation even stranger. Through a mutual acquaintance, I discovered that Jace and Sky had been arguing repeatedly in the weeks before the crash. Their fights weren't small disagreements, either. Several people had overheard arguments about money, but that wasn't all. Apparently, Jace had accused Sky of hiding things from him. Nobody seemed to know exactly what secrets he was referring to, but multiple people remembered hearing him confront her about it. That information stayed in my mind. If Jace knew something important, it could explain why he vanished after the accident. By then, the divide within my family felt permanent. My parents had chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit, but it also gave me clarity. I stopped hoping someone would finally tell the truth. From that moment forward, I made a promise to myself. No matter how uncomfortable the truth became, I was going to uncover it. By that point, I had stopped trusting anything my family told me. Every answer led to another contradiction. Every explanation seemed designed to protect Sky, rather than reveal what had actually happened. If I wanted the truth, I needed to build the timeline myself. I started collecting every piece of information I could find. Witness statements, receipts, security footage, and phone records slowly became a puzzle spread across my dining room table. Night after night, I sat comparing times, locations, and details. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that Sky and Jace had both lied. They had claimed they separated long before the crash. That wasn't true. A restaurant receipt showed 2 meals purchased late that evening. Surveillance footage from a nearby parking lot captured both of them leaving together afterward. Several hours later, another witness remembered seeing them at a convenience store. Most importantly, they were seen with my Escalade, not separately together. One witness clearly remembered Sky because she had been arguing loudly with a man matching Jace's description. Another remembered seeing both of them get into the SUV before driving away. Every new detail pushed the timeline closer and closer to the crash. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Sky and Jace had remained together for hours after telling everyone they had gone their separate ways. They had traveled to multiple locations and appeared increasingly upset as the night went on. Then I uncovered something even more concerning. Several people independently described them arguing. Nobody knew exactly what the fight was about, but everyone remembered the tension. One witness described Sky as furious. Another said Jace looked frustrated and exhausted. Whatever was happening between them, it was serious. The argument appeared to continue right up until the final hours before the accident. At that point, I felt closer than ever to understanding the truth. Then I discovered something that changed the entire investigation. My Escalade had a tracking system. Normally, it recorded location data that could help reconstruct a vehicle's movements. I requested access to the records expecting to find a complete route for the night of the crash. Instead, I found gaps, large gaps. Entire sections of the vehicle's movement history were missing. At first, I assumed it was a technical problem, but after speaking with people familiar with the system, I learned something alarming. The missing data didn't look accidental. Someone had accessed the records and removed portions of the tracking history. I stared at the report in disbelief. Tracking data doesn't simply vanish on its own. Whoever deleted those records knew exactly what they were doing. More importantly, they had a reason. Nobody erases evidence unless they're afraid of what it might reveal. As I looked at the missing hours on the timeline, one thing became painfully clear. The crash itself wasn't the biggest secret anymore. The biggest secret was what happened before the crash, and someone was working very hard to make sure nobody ever found out. For weeks, Jace had been the biggest mystery in the entire case. His damaged phone had been found near the crash site, but nobody knew where he was. Every attempt to contact him failed. Some people believed he had run away. Others thought he was hiding because he had caused the accident himself. Then everything changed. One afternoon, I received a call from an investigator. They had found Jace alive. The news hit me like a shockwave. After weeks of uncertainty, the missing boyfriend had finally surfaced. What mattered now was why he had disappeared. A few days later, I was given the opportunity to speak with him privately. The moment I saw him, I noticed how nervous he looked. He seemed exhausted, as if he hadn't slept properly since the night of the crash. For several minutes, he avoided eye contact and struggled to find the right words. Then, he finally started talking. What he told me confirmed my worst fears. According to Jace, Sky had been driving the Escalade that night. Not only had she been driving, but she had been driving recklessly. He said they had argued repeatedly throughout the evening, and her behavior behind the wheel became increasingly dangerous as the night went on. Everything I had uncovered suddenly started making sense. The witness statements, the changing stories, the missing timeline. Then Jace revealed something even worse. After the crash, Sky had begged him to disappear for a while. She was terrified of the consequences and didn't want investigators asking questions before her parents could figure out a plan. According to Jace, Dean and Paige immediately focused on creating a version of events that would protect Sky from responsibility. Instead of encouraging honesty, they worked to control the story. I sat there in disbelief, as he described conversations that matched many of the suspicions I had been developing for weeks. When I asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, Jace looked down at the floor. He admitted he had been scared. He feared being blamed for the accident. He feared legal consequences. Most of all, he feared being caught in the middle of a family willing to do almost anything to protect Sky. More than once, he had considered telling investigators the truth. Each time, fear stopped him. By the end of our conversation, one fact was impossible to ignore. My parents and sister had not been confused. They had not been mistaken. They had been lying from the very beginning. For the first time since the crash, I finally knew who had been driving my Escalade, and now I had a witness willing to say it out loud. After speaking with Jace, I finally had confirmation that my instincts had been right all along. Sky had been driving the Escalade, and my parents had known far more than they admitted. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt uneasy. Something still wasn't adding up. If Dean and Paige were willing to help hide the truth about the crash, what else had they done behind my back? That question stayed with me as I continued gathering documents related to the insurance claim. I requested records, reviewed correspondence, and carefully examined every detail connected to the investigation. What I found left me speechless. Buried among the documents were communications that I had never seen before. My parents had been contacting insurance representatives without my knowledge. At first, I hoped there was some innocent explanation. Maybe they were simply trying to understand the claims process. Maybe they were looking for information. Then I started reading the actual messages. The more I read, the worse it became. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to distance Sky from responsibility. Several emails suggested that I had a history of being overly protective of the vehicle. Others implied that I may have created confusion about who had permission to use it. One message even hinted that I might have been responsible for the situation because I failed to clearly communicate restrictions regarding the Escalade. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were building a narrative, a false narrative, one that slowly shifted responsibility away from Sky and pushed it toward me. As part of the investigation, there were also recorded conversations. Listening to them was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I heard my parents discussing ways the situation could affect Sky's future. I heard them worrying about financial consequences for her. I heard them discussing possible outcomes if she was found responsible. What I never heard was concern for me, not once. The daughter who had worked for years to buy the vehicle wasn't the person they were trying to protect. I was the person they were willing to sacrifice. The realization hit harder than the crash itself. For weeks, I had been focused on proving what happened that night. I thought the biggest betrayal was the lie surrounding the accident. I was wrong. The real betrayal was discovering how easily my parents were willing to place the burden on me if it meant saving Sky. This was no longer about a destroyed Escalade. It was no longer about insurance claims or missing evidence. It was about understanding my place in the family. For years, I had ignored the favoritism. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I convinced myself that my parents loved both daughters equally. Now I was staring at proof that when Sky needed protection, they didn't hesitate. They chose her. And to save her, they were completely willing to let me carry the consequences. That was the moment something inside me changed forever. The day I hired an attorney was the day everything started to change. For weeks, I had been stuck defending myself against accusations that never should have existed in the first place. My parents had painted me as the problem. Sky had lied repeatedly. Relatives had judged me without knowing the facts. I was tired of reacting. It was time to go on offensive. My attorney advised me to document absolutely everything. Every message, every email, every witness statement, and every piece of evidence connected to the crash. So that is exactly what I did. I organized timelines, saved screenshots, collected records, and created a complete file showing what had happened before and after the accident. As the evidence grew, a clear picture began to emerge. Witnesses placed Sky and Jace together inside the Escalade long after they claimed they had separated. Vehicle records supported the timeline I had reconstructed. Phone data confirmed movements and locations throughout the night. Most importantly, Jace was now willing to testify about what had really happened. For the first time, the facts were lining up, and the facts were devastating for Sky. The pressure started affecting her almost immediately. Every time new information surfaced, her story changed again. One week, she claimed she had barely used the vehicle. The next week, she admitted she had been inside it much later than she originally said. Then, she insisted she couldn't remember important details because she was stressed. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. Even people who had supported her from the beginning started noticing the inconsistencies. Meanwhile, my parents seemed increasingly nervous. Dean and Paige had spent months acting as though they controlled the narrative. Now, they were watching that narrative fall apart piece by piece. They stopped making confident statements. They became careful about what they said in front of others. Every new document seemed to make them more uncomfortable. For the first time, they realized the truth could no longer stay hidden. The shift wasn't limited to my immediate family. Relatives who had criticized me started reaching out with questions. Friends who once believed the rumors wanted to know what was really going on. People were beginning to realize they had only heard one side of the story. The lies were losing their power. What made the biggest difference was how I felt. I was no longer scrambling to prove my innocence. I was no longer trying to explain myself. Instead, I was building a case supported by evidence, witnesses, records, and facts. The people who blamed me were finally starting to question what they had been told. And for the first time since the crash, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: confidence. Because the truth was no longer hiding in the shadows, it was coming into the light. The day of the insurance hearing felt like the final chapter of a nightmare that had consumed my life for months. For so long, I had been forced to defend myself against accusations built on lies. Now, for the first time, every piece of evidence would be examined together in one place. I sat quietly as investigators, attorneys, and insurance representatives reviewed the case. One by one, the facts began to emerge. The timeline I had spent months building was presented in full detail. Surveillance footage showed Sky with the Escalade long after she claimed she had returned it. Witness statements placed both Sky and Jace inside the vehicle on the night of the crash. Phone records confirmed their movements throughout the evening. There was no room left for confusion. Then came Jace's testimony. With everyone listening, he finally told the complete truth. He admitted that Sky had been driving the Escalade that night. He explained how they had argued repeatedly, and how the situation spiraled out of control before the crash. He also described the events afterward, including the pressure to stay quiet and disappear temporarily while a different story was created. The room became noticeably quieter. For months, people had treated his disappearance as a mystery. Now they understood why he had vanished. The evidence continued piling up. Vehicle records, witness accounts, receipts, and communication logs all supported the same conclusion. Most importantly, records proved that I never regained possession of the Escalade after my keys were taken. That fact destroyed one of the biggest lies in the entire case. I had not loaned the vehicle willingly. I had not authorized the trip. I had not been involved in the crash. As the investigation continued, attention shifted toward my parents. Emails, conversations, and other records revealed that Dean and Paige knew much more than they had admitted. Instead of encouraging honesty, they had helped create a version of events designed to shield Sky from responsibility. The truth was impossible to deny. I watched as months of deception collapsed in a matter of hours. The reactions around the room were unforgettable. Several relatives who had criticized me looked stunned. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others appeared shocked by how far my parents had gone to protect Sky. People who once believed I was selfish or unreasonable were finally seeing the full picture. What hurt most was not learning that my sister had lied. It was seeing proof that my parents had willingly participated in the cover-up. By the end of the hearing, there were no more stories left to tell and no more excuses left to make. The truth had finally exploded into the open. And once it did, nobody could put it back together the way they wanted. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived faster than anyone expected. Once the truth became public, insurance investigators launched a deeper review of everything connected to the crash. What had started as a vehicle accident turned into questions about false statements, missing information, and attempts to shift responsibility. Skye could no longer hide behind changing stories. Every lie she had told was now supported by evidence proving otherwise. The protection she had relied on for years finally disappeared. My parents faced their own fallout. Dean and Paige spent months trying to protect Skye at my expense, but their decisions came with a cost. Relationships with relatives became strained, their reputations suffered, and the financial impact of the situation was far worse than they had imagined. For the first time in their lives, they couldn't blame someone else. As for me, I made a decision that surprised many people. I walked away, not out of anger but out of self-respect. I stopped answering calls. I stopped attending family gatherings. I stopped chasing approval from people who had already shown me where I stood when things mattered most. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. I spent time with friends who supported me, returned my attention to my career, and surrounded myself with people who valued honesty. Little by little, the stress and pain of the past year began to fade. Several months later, my parents reached out. Their messages sounded very different from before. They wanted to talk. They wanted forgiveness. They wanted another chance. The truth was simple. They had finally realized that Skye couldn't fix the damage that had been done, but by then it was too late. I wished them well and moved on. One afternoon, I drove home in a brand new vehicle that I had purchased entirely on my own. As I sat behind the wheel, I thought about everything that had happened. They had tried to make me the scapegoat. They had sacrificed me to protect someone else. In the end, none of their plans worked because the one person they were willing to lose became the only person who walked away truly free.